and just to give us a bit of profile that she may want to share with us. And then I will take it on from there, from Anne to the rest of the panelists in whichever order. Honorable Anne.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Adeke Anebaju. I'm a woman. I'm a lawyer. I'm a member of parliament representing Soroti District. I belong to the Forum for Democratic Change, which I serve as Deputy President in charge of Eastern Uganda. Thank you. That should be just about it.
Thank you, Honorable Anne. Trish.
Morning, everyone. I'm Precious Trisha Avoli. I work with Akina Mama Africa under the Economic Justice and Climate Action Program. And I'm a feminist and lawyer. Nice to meet you all.
Right. Jacob.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Deyeru. I serve young people in this country as a chairperson of the National Youth Council. I like adding that it's a volunteer position for the benefit of everyone. But I'm happy to be here and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Elizabeth, if she has joined. Okay, I'm not sure if Elizabeth has joined. Maria, you can introduce yourself, please. I know people have heard your voice.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rahom Maria Bukirwa. I'm a lawyer and the program manager at the Women's Pro Bono Initiative. I'm happy to be in this space.
Thank you very much, our panelists. Now, this conversation comes hot on the heels of the passing of the Employment Amendment Act 2023 on 24th May. Before the passing of this act, there were a couple of recommendations that were made from all corners, from the employers and the employees and activist groups. Some of the key issues that come through this Employment Amendment Act, which of course has not yet been assented to by the president. So part of our discussion is based on what the bills have been saying and what has come out of parliamentary debate on the same. I am glad that we have a member of parliament to give us perspective on what has gone there. We will try to condense this conversation specifically on the issues that touch on women in this country and how this employment amendment or these amendments will be affecting them. But a bit of statistics for perspective. One of the things that comes out prominently from the data available is that in Uganda, women spend 1.9 times as much time on unpaid domestic work and care work than men do. 14.6% of the day is spent on household work for women, as opposed to 7.5% for the men. And this, for context, is unpaid domestic or care work. We have issues of 30% of women being employed in senior and middle positions, and the majority of women in the labor market or who contribute to the economy are involved in either unpaid care work or casual labor, employed as casual laborers in factories, especially in the horticulture industry, and also a couple of them in the hospitality and service industry. So this conversation is extremely important in appreciating whether the laws that are being passed by Parliament have a bias towards benefiting the plight of women in this country, or at least improving it, and whether those conversations matter. So we will really dive quick into this discussion. One of the key things that comes out of this discussion is the question of casual workers. And I will address this question to Honorable Anna Deke and Mr. Jacob Eyeru. Now, one of the issues is that where someone has worked for, the existing regime has been that where someone has worked for more than 4 months, you're supposed to employ them on a written contract. This was one of the proposals that received backlash from Parliament, that proposals on casual workers. Honorable Deke, what is the rationale of most of Parliament, especially not really from an individual perspective, but what was the issue in Parliament as to why did this receive a lot of pushback from especially the government side? Why doesn't the government want to give casual workers written employment contracts?
Okay, thank you. Well, first, about casual workers, it wasn't the whole of Parliament. It didn't receive a pushback from the entire Parliament. It was just a few MPs. I remember the minister, I think from Ministry of Trade and Cooperatives, Honorable Bahati, expressed that it wouldn't be harmonious with his department as Trade and Industry to unofficially, okay, maybe officially deem a contract term of employment after the expiration of a certain time, because that it doesn't work like that in his sector. That's what he said. But some of the members were submitting actually in support of it. Generally, I think that the issue about casual workers and deeming a contract to exist goes beyond, it goes into even the domestic space, because you know that the definitions that were brought in the amendment were broad. So it opens up into the domestic space. It goes to every space. These people, these employees who do not get NSSF, they don't have gratuity, they don't have these assured benefits that other former employees have. So it was really introduced by Honorable Kunihira to protect them, because they're not strictly working under any terms. That means that if they are terminated, they don't have NSSF to run to, they don't have gratuity, they don't have anything they're saving, the statutory benefits that exist. So the only way to protect them would be to deem a contract to exist after the expiration of that time. I remember like it was 6 months, although you mentioned 4 months, but I remember like it was 6 months. And for me, I really supported it, because these are a special category of people whose work, whose effort is so easily abused. Say, for instance, not like in a household, a shamba boy, or you understand, like our domestic workers, like the maids, they're really unprotected. If you go to factory settings, these people who carry items, they're doing hard labor, but they are not officially paid. You understand, they are very unprotected and they don't have a fallback position. So I think that this really comes in to protect them, and most importantly, women, because you find that many women do not have the capacity to negotiate favorable employment terms for themselves. And most of them are the ones who are offering the casual labor. So for me, it's very important, and it protects women. It goes by far a long way in protecting women. So that's my view.
Yeah, Honorable, and just to add a few thoughts on that, what is from your view, from hearing Honorable Bahati submit on it and a few other MPs, what is the motivation in terms of benefiting investments? And perhaps after you, Jacob, can just chip in on this. Because it seems to me that there is a lot of stuff going on in these business investment parks, where there are so many casual laborers, the majority of which are women. It seems to me that there is something that some of the people in high places want to cover up in terms of not giving elaborate protections to these casual workers. What do you think is the motivation of the government or of some of the people who have come out strongly against this provision? And it is accurate, you did mention about the 6 months. In the regulations of the law as it is now, it was 4 months, but the amendment proposed 6 months. So that is accurate to that end. So Honorable, what is it? What's the motivation for government? And after you, Jacob, can just chip in on this.
Well, my feeling is that government is always trying to side with the investors. Many investors come to our country because they know labor is so cheap. They know they can mistreat employees and get away with it. I saw yesterday an employee who had been electrocuted in a Chinese factory, just left helplessly. So they come to Uganda because they know, number one, labor is cheap, and they have government support to that. Government also feels that with this huge burden of so many unemployed people, unskilled people, let's just leave it open so that whoever, it's just an issue of chance and fate. If you're able to get 5,000 daily, you get it. If you get it for only a month, at least you've earned something. If you're not being well treated, they can, you can leave and someone else will replace you. So I get the feeling that they do it because maybe they want to cordon off that as almost like a latent benefit for the investors, but it is very unfair because it's really done at the expense of the human rights of Ugandans who are very vulnerable. So they offer their labor no matter what. The conditions are very difficult. And I think that that's the point from which the minister was reasoning, which is really unfortunate because I think that despite the fact that we have so much labor, so much unskilled labor, so many unemployed Ugandans who are looking for a means of survival, I think it's still important to put their human rights first.
Thank you, Anne. Jacob, from where really Anne stops, what's that resounding thing that keeps coming in from government on protection of investors when the question of employee rights is raised? Why is it such a big issue? This has come up even on the question of minimum wage. This would be a very important conversation for example, casual workers. At least there should be a bare minimum. What is it from government? And I know you may crucify me for not for pinning you to the wall, but I know you were elected on the NRM ticket, so part of your obligation is to also promote the NRM manifesto. So what's the underlying thing that government is trying to protect with investors and employees? Jacob, please.
Thank you, my brother, Tarima. Text of and how I've understood the argument. Of the president on the issue. You are first of all looking to grow your a certain quality of jobs. If you look at it in the context of where the country is, for instance, if we the location of you take the location of Mbali, these two areas that then what you need to achieve is one. I need to get that clarified. Tarimo, can you confirm if you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Your network is breaking a bit, but I can hear you clearly now.
Is it clearer now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So as saying, in the context of provision of employment and protection of workers vis-a-vis the environment for investment, in the government's view, with the status of unemployment in these regions, but also with the nature of the GDP question of the country, the government is more comfortable first providing for a favorable environment to have enough investment. And when you spring up enough investment, then you can provide for a better working environment with this investment. This is not an argument, of course, that applies to everyone. And I think that is why, for the first time, casual labor has gotten a definition in the new in the new law. In the previous law, there's no specific definition for what casual labor is, even though the new law has still not provided for contracts. The generally acceptable idea now is that there's a recognized presence of those people. And in recognizing them, I think for the first time, we are beginning to talk about an area of rights because there is an existent recognition of such groups of people. So why is government a bit short-handing on the issue of minimum wage? I think the general perception is when you have a minimum wage structure in the country, first of all, that minimum wage would not make sense if it is below a living wage, where the living wage is what would provide for a person or at the very minimum, anyone really, be able to live within the prevailing economic conditions of that country. In that case, if you look at the fragility of economies like our countries of third world and so on, what you're looking at the end of the day is a situation where government has to keep adjusting the minimum wage with the inflation rate, with the economic reality of the global south or even the global economic build itself, such that that minimum wage can meet the requirements of a living wage at the very minimum. In that case, it means you don't have supreme control over workers' pay in terms of your investment ideas as an investor. So government's fear is that the country is in dire need of investment, and that dire need of investment should first be met before the logic of how much each worker is paid is put to the fore. And if you ask me, I think that there's some rationale there to say that what you need more now is what you prioritize, and then you can address issues later. And this is not to say that casual workers do not have rights. This is not to say that they do not deserve very good treatment. But in the face of what the country's trajectory should be, the country needs to have a conversation on prioritization. That's one.
But
Two,
Jacob, if I may just cut you short on that, your argument seems to me to be that we need to elevate the potential of investment, while in the implicit effect of that argument is that if some people will have to suffer at the expense of that elevation of investment, so be it, until we come to the place where we can say our investment is strong enough, to buttress this kind of situation. What I don't hear is what is the balance? Where do we draw the balance and say, okay, we are not yet at the level where investment can get this, but are there minimum protections that are not just on paper, but active protections for casual workers, and with the context in mind, that you have vulnerable groups of people involved in the hospitality, in the construction industry, in the horticulture industry. Those are some of the industries that attract most numbers of casual laborers who are women. And the issue is not even just that they are women per se of majority age. This is also people who are, 15, 14. What is the balance the government is proposing in light of this this view?
So I really don't think that government is looking at balancing anything. I think government is looking at prioritization. Because if you're talking about casual labor in this country, there are so many forms of problems with casual laborers in this country. But I think government right now, very clear that I mean the president. The agenda of the president is accelerating investment growth. And his argument, again, how I've understood it, is that when you don't have any option to create jobs, okay, then what you first need is to discuss how you can create those jobs. Then later, when there is a plausible amount of creation, then you can talk about what quality of jobs there are. But if you don't even have the avenue for creating jobs, then you ask yourself, how do we create jobs? That is the question that I think the president is prioritizing. When it comes to the rights of the people that are at the workplace, at a personal level, I would advocate for a better environment, for people to understand their work environment, but also to feel safe in that work environment, especially from their government. But you are not going to prioritize both of them if most of your investors come from the East. And by the East, I mean China. I mean the emerging global economy that is controlled from the East. In the East, even in those countries, the framework of investment is such that you depend on the cheapest possible labor that is available. And the cheapest possible labor could mean so many people who are simply doing nothing. They should just fit one small part. And if someone is fainting, that does not matter to them. What matters to them is that you're able to produce at a particular rate. And I think over time, that model has demonstrated that it works, albeit at the expense of some of the wishes of people who prefer to see that human rights, women's rights, workers' rights are coming at the same rate as economic development. I also do not know of a place where development has come in at the same rate, especially in building a strong production culture, but also a strong economic return for an economy generally. I don't know a place in the world where that has happened with a very strong place for labor rights. I think labor rights come in as a secondary necessity after there is a boom and where they can be guaranteed by the legal system that is now efficient and funded by the production of such an economic return. So for me, that is really how I see it. And I want to just be clear, I don't think government is finding a balance. I think government is having a prioritization. And whenever you'd ask government about the laws, they say, no, workers are generally protected, they have representation, and so on. And so on the political sphere of things, it appears like workers have a voice. It appears like workers have some sort of return, and government will tell you that trade unions operate. So it would appear that that's government's point of balance. And therefore, they basically circumvent their responsibility in terms of how people feel at the workplace to sacrifice that for the purpose of prioritizing how many people can have a workplace to begin with.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jacob. And I think Elizabeth would like to respond to some of the assertions you make, and I welcome this response now. But in view of that as well, Elizabeth, for context, I will just ask that you also address and quickly after you, perhaps Trish will come in as well. I'd like, because Honorable Adeke pointed out the nexus or the correlation between our understanding of casual work, but also casual workers, but also the
I can't hear anyone. Is someone speaking?
I think we lost him. I also do not hear.
I think we've lost Tarema. Patrick, if you could double check that.
Yeah, Charima has been lost, but he will try to rejoin. Maybe Elizabeth can be responding to the question that had been asked, the first question.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Patrick. I lost him around the second question, so I will just share my thoughts on some of the responses that he has given. I like that you draw us to the bigger problem. I think the problem that the Employment Amendment Act seeks to address is one broader than, and I'm making this comment because this is something that I've had over time, is one broader than just maybe casualization of labor and protection of casual workers. And so I just wanted to give that context. I think one of the things that I'd like for us in this conversation to do is to draw and then find the linkage between women and informality of labor, because in there lies a huge problem. I think it's not a mistake that in the informal sector is made up of mostly women. It's not a mistake. I know it's caused by many, many other deliberate reasons. One, because maybe education status of men and women, of boys and girls, has not moved, that we've not tried to close that gap between maybe the education, that is accessibility of education to both girls and boys, but also bigger than that is that how do women get into the market, get into the labor market? Which kind of employments are they getting? And I know you spoke about what is the nature of employment that is being created by the many foreign, for example, foreign direct investments that are coming to Uganda. For me, that's what I wanted to emphasize. I think the problem of informality brings, or what can I call it, nurtures an economy where there's always going to be cheap labor. So there's always going to be a class of people that are on the lower end of the bargaining end of the rope, where we have a capitalistic group of people that are able to afford this cheap labor. And then there's always going to be these groups of people that are giving this cheap labor. So I just thought it important that as maybe we continue the conversation on this bill and how it's affecting women in the informal sector, for us to maybe interrogate, why does the informal sector continue to have more women? And why is it that the nature of jobs that women get into, even when they get out of the domestic rail, in quote unquote, why is it that that is the nature of work that is available for women? And maybe that can lead us into the conversation of what is the nature of jobs on the market right now, and the nature of jobs that, in quote unquote, are presented to women and especially young people by either direct foreign investment or any other investments by non-state actors and state actors. So as you were speaking, Jacob, I just thought I'd make that addition. So I think I'll just wait for the moderator to come back on to ask the question that he was asking before. Thank you.
Elizabeth, I'm on. I just wanted to get perspective on your last point. There's something you said about the reasons why we still have women making up the majority of the workers in the informal sector. And I would like you to just take it up from there and sort of shed a picture of whether this is something we have entrenched from a legal point of view, the existing law, and whether even the laws that are coming through are really just trying to buttress or entrench a position where women are the eternal players in this informal sector. You mentioned a very important issue in the beginning of submission, where you said that this is deliberate. Just shed some light on that deliberateness. What is it? Why do you call it deliberate? Is there a conspiracy from the players, from government players, to make women on the lower ranks of I don't know. Maria, can you confirm that you can hear me, please?
Your network is breaking. I don't know if Elizabeth got your question. Is she on?
I don't know, is it still now? I'm in a relatively stable internet place.
It was breaking. I don't know if Elizabeth got your question. Elizabeth, are you there?
Is she on the call though?
She's gone off, but I can be able to speak to it since I
Okay.
work with women. Maybe you can rephrase and I can chip in.
No, I just wanted to, she brought an important issue on the deliberateness. And the issue is whether, where is that coming from? Are we participating, especially speaking from the men's perspective? Is there a conspiracy from government, from the players, the investors, to just silence the position of women and then keep them on the lower rank?
Okay, I will respond. It might be, I do not, let me state it this way, the discrimination that the women face, it's not only limited to the employment sector, but all various sectors. It's first of all systemic in nature, that there is structural barriers created by history, that these translate even in the laws that are made, but also implementation discussions. If you followed some of the discussions in Parliament regarding formulations of laws and how perspectives of women are brought in, some of the comments you'll see are sexist, some of the comments you'll see there is a deeply entrenched perspective of the patriarchal narrative, which informs our history as a country. We cannot deny that, but we should be able to grow from that angle, to know that we are growing and there is gender mainstreaming, gender transformative agendas intentionally being brought in terms of even budget discussions, law reforms. It's the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, but we still have aspects of gender that are not well articulated even when we are formulating these laws. I'll not deny that there has been some progress. For example, I think my point will reach, but I will preempt the discussion to that. The discussion on pregnancy not being a ground to have someone terminated from their form of employment. There were things that were evaded and seen as trivial issues, not to be written down in laws, but now you see us moving from that direction to having these discussions at the forefront, and that entrenchment of the patriarchy in some of the things that we discuss, of having women's issues trivialized, that it becomes something substantial to discuss when maybe a woman is dead. But now you'll see this discussion coming to the forefront. Not everyone is on board. That's the thing. Not everyone is on board. Not everyone understands the gravity of leaving women behind and not having these discussions brought to the forefront, because our women are not homogeneous. We don't have a one size fits all. Our lives are not in a box. There are other factors that determine how we interact with all these different spaces. And we have laws that point to this, but the implementation, the practice, we're going to have this amendment even come up showing that pregnancy should not be a ground for dismissal, but what is going to be the practice? What is the narrative out there that women are considered a liability because of their maternal function? Is the law going to change that narrative and take it away? So that ingrained structural bias that stems from history, and this history is not alienated from people. There are people who have benefited from this history. There are people who have benefited from this patriarchy. There are people who have benefited from having more women in the casual space. They are bargaining power. When you talk about the power imbalance in the spaces of employment, it's not only in the spaces of employment, it's also in decision-making spaces in parliament, where of course there will be the argument of we have more women in these spaces, but what is the quality of discussion that the women in these spaces are having? Are they able to speak to these issues? And if they're able to, are they the majority or the minority? But I'll be alive to the issues of progress being made. For example, there was even a case that was filed before the amendment discussion on having breastfeeding facilities in places of employment, that the employment amendment provides for maternity leave, but the question of addressing the breastfeeding of the extra 3 months, how are these women supposed to breastfeed their babies or cater for that aspect of their lives while keeping their employment? How is this question being addressed? And
Maria,
it's good. I am preempting my part.
Not necessarily, but I would like to bring in Trish on this conversation.
Yes.
Because there's been, I don't want us to lose sight of the casualization issue vis-a-vis the domestication, the issue of domestic labor. So yeah, I'd like to issue. Why have a conversation on unpaid care work? Why is it a problem for, especially as Maria keeps talking about the patriarchy, the biggest discrimination going on within homes which have domestic workers are actually, part of them are clearly meted out by the women paid work. I thought you had not got the question, but here we are.
No, you're breaking, but in my understanding of the question, there are literally like 2 of them. So I'll attempt to answer. But before I go into the issue of unpaid care work, I wanted to add my voice to Elizabeth's question earlier on the deliberation. But that is speaking to our market economy currently and how it is affecting women's participation in the affecting women's economic empowerment. So we see that our economy right now is inherently gendered. We have the male, we have the female. And we praise ourselves to be a mixed economy, or rather liberal economy, the Uganda economy, that is. And the effect of this is that it causes a disconnect, which primarily affects women as they continue to be the foundation of social development. So there's quite a stretch between economic empowerment, and social development, or social justice, as you may want to say it. So we know that women make up, following the recent demographic survey, women make up over half of our population, but this is not reflected in the workforce because of the systematic arrangements that have over time really affected women and pushed them to be second-class citizens. So women are not accessing the same political, social, and economic opportunities as men, and this affects negatively their social development. So to sum these negative impacts of an economic manifestation and this gendered liberal market, the global capitalization of the world really also adds on to these systematic issues, making the gap between the men and women even grow further. So women, now linking it to the unpaid care work, is that we know that women juggle between paid care work and unpaid care work, two types of work. So this makes them actually work more hours than men will do at every level. So on how the unpaid domestic care work and the unpaid care work that women do does not get the value that it deserves every day, and yet it is the foundation of the economy. Because then if there was no unpaid care work, like Elizabeth stated earlier, that this is the cheap labor that everyone gets. Because if there is no cheap labor, then the men are not actually going to produce as much as they do right now. But then what's the impact of that on the women? This is not recognized. It is not anywhere written. And even this bill in its attempt to really recognize it, it is impractical to actually, what's the term? It's impractical to enforce it. So then that just leaves it as something as following just the International Labour Organization laws and treaties, because we're part of this treaty. So we really just incorporate it in our laws and shelve it in the bookshelf. So it is really, for me, it's really coming from an angle of are we really recognizing the unpaid care work, or we are just trying to mitigate our, to just say that we advance women's rights and then just put it in a book somewhere into writing and without any popularization, nothing, no enforceability. Because what the bill then says about domestic work is that first, it recognizes domestic workers as employees. So this means that every Ugandan, every single person in Uganda who employs a person like a housemaid, who is really a house enabler, despite the language used in the book, a nanny, a shamba boy, a gardener, a driver, or anything, they should then sign a contract of service with each of them, entailing their scope of work. So that means that these people are entitled to leave, they're entitled to all the benefits that an employer, medical benefits and everything that a former employer then gets. So the implication is that in addition to looking for and saving money to pay like basic domestic households, so any person in Uganda employing a domestic worker will also have to put aside money to get the benefits, to cater for the benefits of these employees. So how practical is that for a normal Ugandan, of which most of us are really living below the poverty line, and yet we still need these house enablers and work enablers? So then we should be mindful of the fact that the bill is there, yes, but its practicability on recognizing care work, recognizing domestic work, recognizing women's efforts, like Maria mentioned earlier on the issue of the lactation conspicuous places in designated workplaces to be provided, but the practicability of it all does not then match the words in the bill. So then this leaves the unpaid care work and the domestic work still redundant and still unprovided for in the normal sense. So because to me the bill is, yes, Parliament moved to protect all these types of, to recognize all these types of work and recognize all these types of workers. But in actual sense, we are just mirroring the international laws. and yet not taking into consideration the lived realities of people in Uganda. You cannot.
Trish,
Yes.
if I may just come in on that. One of the questions that bogs my mind on this issue is, part of the clarity that has been coming out from the old laws as we knew them is issues on definition of workplaces. And again, it's hard to discuss the amendments to the Employment Act without factoring in any possible amendments in laws like Workers' Compensation, Occupational Safety and Health Act and all that. One of the key questions that comes through is the question of workplace definition, the definition of what a workplace is. And in the amendments, then if you include domestic workers, then you're looking at a home as a workplace. But also you're looking at a home as a workplace in the context. First, in what context are you looking at the home as a workplace? Because Jacob raised an important point on the issue of the employer not being able to keep their word on the benefits they promise. So, and you've raised it a bit. How do you draw the balance for employers in homes which are considered workplaces and the benefits like leave, medical insurance and NSSF and pay as you earn? How do you draw the balance where you are not going to create an avalanche of suits coming from homes?
Not sure I get your question right, but in attempting to answer it, is what the question you've been asking to me then speaks to the impracticability of the bill and its recognition of domestic workers. Because unlike other countries, Uganda does not register the informal employers or does not require a particular entity to be in charge of distributing the domestic enablers. So then what this bill is going to bring, it's going to just bring a whole new lot of gap between informal and the formal, or like you say, the definition of what really is a workplace in the ideal sense of the world we are living in. Because these details are some of the things that have been left out by the bill. So then its impracticability of course really then stems from all of those things. But also recognizing, as Jacob said earlier, that we do not have a minimum wage bill, a minimum wage bill. So then it is very uneasy to then determine how much you pay this person, how much benefits they should get, or what kind of benefits are there for them to actually also get. But also, how do we determine who is the domestic worker in the informal sector? Because they are not registered. I just go to probably somewhere else and get someone to become my house enabler, and that is all that is there. So there's nothing like a registration. There's nothing like I don't know. There's nothing to really put value to their work in terms of recognizing them as in person, for them to actually get benefit from, or them actually knowing that the bill is actually catering for them, is something that is going to be hard to implement.
Yes, you raised that very last point is very helpful, and perhaps I will ask Honorable Adeke to come in on this. Honorable Adeke, are we ready for the conversation on domestic work or remuneration, better benefits? Are we ready for that conversation as a nation? Is our family structure and spectrum as we know it ready for that conversation, both from the philosophical orientational perspective, but also from a financial perspective? Most of the people in these homes, apart from the really, really up-end people, are really middle class citizens, earning probably not more than 1 million per month. Is that something as a nation, a conversation we are ready to have on dealing with both domestic work, but also unpaid care work for the women who stay to take care of babies in homes and do the largest percentage of the house chores? Is this a conversation we are ready to do? If yes, from a parliamentarian's perspective, what could be the better implementation of perspectives?
Well, I feel that somehow the conversation has to be triggered, and that we should not wait for everything else to be in place, because if we do that, it's going to take very long. And whichever way we can trigger it at this end, so maybe like the Nordic countries, you find that women's labor is actually counted and comprises a part of the country's GDP, because of also what the state is able to invest in women and girls. They have equal access to opportunities. Girls are going to school. They are not dropping out. They are not vulnerable and cannot negotiate for some, a better employment contract. A woman sits in a house and is starting to have children and is starting to do more care work for her family. It's really reasonable to note that she is qualified, has studied, is educated, and is qualified to actually be employed, but is choosing to do care work, and therefore it should be counted as labor and paid for. So I think that we really cannot wait for everything else to fall into place before we start to have this conversation. We have to trigger it. And it may not seem like the right point to trigger it, because I'm alive to the fact that some of the amendments that we made are a bit problematic and maybe just may exist only in the law and not really be enforced to the dots. However, it's worthwhile that we start the conversation, that we trigger it at this point. Number one, it shows the willingness to recognize women's efforts, the willingness to recognize casual labor, and also recognize these so many Ugandans who are offering their labor and remain vulnerable. And I think that at least that spirit in the law is commendable. That's what I believe.
Thank you, Honorable Deke. This should move us into the next conversation. One of the key issues that comes out of the proposed amendments and the bill that will be going to the president for assent is the question of maternity leave and lactation centers, breastfeeding mothers on the job. Trish and Maria, probably you can come in first. Have we now hit the ceiling of protection of women at the workplace in terms of maternal mothers who are employed and their unique maternal responsibilities? Have we now hit the ceiling with this amendment? Have we reached what we wanted?
I'll go first. It's a win to have this discussion and have this right recognized in law. But of course, beyond the paper, we would need to have implementation accepted, the lived realities, but also look at context. The previous discussion of the casualization of labor, but also this intersects with the protection, the maternal protections of women in the casual employment, those who do not have yet the protection of contracts, and how the bargaining power for them is not equal to those who would be in workspaces that provide for contracts. So yes, it's a tricky ground to walk, but the law is a starting point. Implementation needs to be something that we look forward to in 2 areas of widely disseminating this perspective, having discussions further. I know that once the bill has been assented to, there's also the obligation of the minister to put in place regulations. But what is the process of making this regulation? Is there input? Is there a place for discussion for affected persons to have their inputs into what the regulations would be? Is there evidence-based research to inform these regulations? Because we have always had this problem of passing and making laws which are not evidence-based, and there is no proper research backing it up. There is a place of the legislators, but also there is a place of the technical people, the policymakers, who have to now translate the laws into regulations which will be applied based on the realities on ground. Now, the issue of the maternal rights of women in workplaces, there is still that thin line to walk of, yes, there is the law that states pregnancy should not be a ground for dismissal, but there is also the practice that happens of having women dismissed because of their pregnancy, but it is not what is shown on paper. But also for those who don't even have contracts, what is the discussion of the maternal rights of women in casual employment? This is a house help. She also has a right to found a family. Yes, so she's been in casual employment, there is no contract, and she's dismissed because she's also pregnant. There is that conversation that has not yet been intersected into the Employment Act, but also we look forward to seeing the regulations. How will they be able to inform this aspect? But also we have had the issue of progressive realization. It has been the same problem we've had for disability rights. Most of our places are not disability friendly or accessible, and there's always the question of economic practicability of having places being forced to have access for persons living with disability. Now also the question of, is there political will and commitment on part of the government in terms of gender responsive budgeting? Will there be provision, of course, starting from the place of government employment, for these breastfeeding rooms, which shall government lead by example? Then we'll have people in the private sector have to invest in these breastfeeding rooms. It's something that has not yet materialized because of, one, there are economic realities that we face. There's still the power imbalance that's on ground, despite that we have the law. It's not a magic wand that is going to just sweep away the systemic discrimination that women have faced since time immemorial. Three, we have the people who are going to implement what is their perspective on women's rights. Is there priority to have investment financially into creating these breastfeeding rooms? Or will women be seen as a liability after this law passes? Will there be a backlash now that there is a law, and people who are aware of the implications of going against the law, will they altogether do away with employing women because now they face an obligation of putting in place breastfeeding rooms, also putting in place provision for the maternity leave days, now that it is written in black and white? It's something that still needs to be, it's a mindset change issue, and you'll know that it's something that won't happen overnight. It's a process, and conversations like this to trigger people's minds to think about other issues regarding implementation of women's rights beyond the black and white of the law. Now that we have the law, it's a step in the right direction. The financial commitment to have these laws implemented, first by the duty bearers, the government, is it willing to have the political will, even in gender responsive budgeting? We're going to have the budget discussions coming up. where is the sound of showing, I know in terms of budgeting, there is that gender certificate that you have to show that there's been gender mainstreaming in the allocation of funds. We've been having the issue of maternal rights, even in hospitals, not being catered for and funding being cut left, right, center to the health sector. Now in the labor sector, will there be commitment financially to translate this law that the parliament is passing so that there is now provision of breastfeeding rooms, provision of employers having the maternity leaves strictly enforced, and also the aspect of domestic workers who the issue of trafficking, because most of the 90%, the percentage, I'm not sure, it's 70, either 70 or 60% of persons who are trafficked are women. Now this aspect of also casual laborers, but casual labor from the angle of women who are taken abroad to do this informal employment. There is so much that needs to be implemented, and it needs financial commitment, because when you talk, yes,
Maria, I hear you on the financial commitment, and I think that's a very important angle, especially on the logistical dimension. You mentioned this looks like it's feasible with corporate entities that are involved in the day-to-day service industry, banks, audit houses, law firms, like, you know. What about the issue of breastfeeding mothers on building sites, in horticultural farms, in the hospitality industry? How do you then logistically handle the question of implementation? Because I think that's a dimension that you're raising. What are some of the proposals we can bring to the fore to help in the implementation in some of these places where it's not a typically corporate entity?
Okay, in terms of obligation towards their workers, I know these are entities, now that you've spoken about the horticulture entities, they have responsibility and accountability towards government in terms of other financial obligations. There should be at least measures in terms of assessment to weigh and see if now these places are putting in place accommodation or allowances equivalent to the accommodation needed for breastfeeding rooms. Once this bill is passed, there should be a follow-up beyond having the black and white of the law implementation. Of course, there is the other laws that work in tandem with the Employment Act, and they are officers in charge of seeing, ensuring that the standards that employment places are met and are in tandem with the law. But this should not just be something in black and white that in all my time of employment, you have never encountered any of these officers doing their checks or routine checks, and there'll always be the question of financial availability or availability of resources to monitor the implementation of these places. So you'll just rely on whistleblowers or people of goodwill coming up with a hashtag on the health sector, a hashtag on employment sector. And that has been the way to hold some of these places accountable. But I feel.
Yes, I can. I think we've lost Maria briefly.
I am back. My network, my connection went off. At what point did you lose me?
I think we lost you at the point where you were discussing the whistleblowing aspect.
Yes. So in terms of implementation, to follow up, it's tricky on the part of private entities, but there is a place of accountability that the entities have towards the state because they're operating in the country, and there are measures put in place, officers who follow up with the state, the health, the safety, the state of safety of these places where employers are employed. And I have seen that mostly this follow-up is mainly in bigger corporations, or it's on the base of someone whistleblowing, but there should be investment for these officers to follow up and see that these places are putting up structures that align with the laws. And of course, it's going to come with financial implications, but we have seen how resources at some point, priorities, things are distributed, and I believe it's high time that there is a commitment financially from the place of government to have these officers in place to follow up and see that these places have these structures in place, or there should be a time frame on which government should state that they are going to have these structures in place. And we'll still follow up with the discussion with policymakers, implementers, mindset change, with workers, having conversations like this. I believe it's not something just to tick off the boxes, but it drives discussion, it starts discussion. Right now we're having an Unemployment Act that addresses all these maternal functions, but this did not just start out of the blue. These were discussions that were started from way back by other women rights activists who went ahead and had these discussions, and it started like a laughing matter of, you want me to employ you and now you want me to provide for your maternity leave. So, but now here we are, they're recognized as actual rights for women in the workspaces. So I believe that it will translate, it will take time, but there has to be a starting point. That's part of my recommendation.
Right, thank you, Maria. Trish, could you just come in and give perspective on this whole discussion on breastfeeding mothers at the workplace? But if you could just start from where Maria stopped on the logistical implications. We also missed the opportunity to increase maternity leave from 60 to 90 days, as had been the proposal. Is the idea of breastfeeding lactation centers rather a trade-off or a compromise for maternity leave increase, or is it something that is a standalone on its own? Yeah, Trish, please, if you can come in on this as well.
Thank you for that, Tarimo. My beginning shots will be that as Africans, I think we really need to stop mirroring the white man's ideas and ideologies, because then I know that the breastfeeding clause comes in to follow the International Labour Organization, I think it's Convention 183. So we see that breastfeeding, of course, is an important aspect for a woman and a child, for women and children's health. But also, for me, from the angle it was brought in, and like Maria said, its enforcement is really impractical. And this then leaves out, because this was made without the lived realities of what really a normal Ugandan goes through, or a normal employer in Uganda actually goes through. And so we see that, of course, for workplaces that will incorporate lactation breastfeeding rooms, it will improve their image, it will improve their their work efficiency, of course, having the employer more around and whatnot. But then within the breastfeeding, with the suggestion of incorporating breastfeeding rooms, we are leaving out the people that are taking care, the caretakers of the kids, of the children that actually come accompanying the children to these workplaces. They are not taken into account. And so even with these breastfeeding rooms, of course, if the woman is supposed to be getting out of a meeting every 3 seconds, then we are missing out on most important discussions. But then also to commend the government for the efforts to actually recognize breastfeeding rooms as something that is very important. And also the time, taking the 30-minute breastfeeding breaks daily for every 2 hours, and not reducing it off the contractual hours. It's something, plausible. But then how practical is this to the normal Ugandan employer? Because then we just mirror, in a normal workplace in Uganda really has 3 rooms and 1 kitchen and an outside door. And so how practical is it for that 3-roomed office to actually go and take part and cut off one of the rooms to be a breastfeeding room for the women? I mean, for the breastfeeding mothers to actually come and breastfeed in this room, and then you're cutting off, because then breastfeeding rooms are supposed to be safe, quiet, very clean. So then we have to put in people to come and clean these rooms daily. But also apart from the cleaning, they have to be well, designed and all that to, to enable the child, to ease the child into the whole, the child and mother, to give them a better environment. So its practicability of it all is what worries me. And it seems we are really just stepping on the backs of women to incorporate a capitalistic thing that really then gains nothing. And like Maria said, to just shelve it over in the book somewhere and say we are promoting women's rights. But also it is nice that you asked me this question, but I'd also really like to hear from the men what they think about it. But also having breastfeeding rooms then means we have to train all managers of the importance of breastfeeding, workplaces of the importance of breastfeeding, and also to bring them on board, which of course from the very first time we always have this conversation, it seems like it's a women's issue. So, but it's not a women's issue, because we know these are all. So
thank you, Trish.
I didn't get
sorry.
the last question on linking it to. You could just repeat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have to cut you short, but the issue was on whether it was a trade-off as opposed to a standalone, because there was a proposal in the bills to increase maternity leave to 90 days, a proposal that was really vehemently rejected by the Attorney General, and I doubt it will make it into the final act for assent. Was it a missed opportunity that we will not have 90 days, or was it a trade-off that, pragmatically will work? If you could answer that briefly, then I move to, we need to address 2 other sticky issues.
I think to me, it is a trade-off. Like I mentioned earlier, this is something we just put in black and white and then shelved, but without any practical foreseeability whatsoever, without incorporate this. So it is better to just provide for this and not increase the leave, because then once it's shelved, no one will come back to read it and, hold people accountable, that even when we try, it will never really be publicized than if you put the 6 months leave.
Thank you, Tricia. You raised an issue that I want Jacob to come in on. Jacob, Trisha's talked about the fact that this conversation is usually left to the women, but in terms of culture orientation, mindset change, availing the resources, as we have already seen, the statistics are that the majority of men are in senior senior management positions and those mid-level positions. So basically this obligation, while the benefit is for the women, the obligation largely falls on the men in the offices, in terms of implementation, in terms of the statistical dimension. Jacob, what can we do from a mindset shift change? I've seen people tweet in taxis when a woman takes out her breast to breastfeed, people are throwing tantrums and saying this is so unhygienic and all. And I think for me, it's largely a culture and mindset problem. How do we facilitate this conversation in workplaces, especially in your constituency, among young people and in government corridors of power?
Thank you, Tarama. First of all, I think there's a whole ministry to facilitate the conversation, and it is a ministry that brought the bill, tabled it, and has it as a responsibility to introduce such conversation. So I think that there is a good place to cultivate that for entry within government. But I think that the problem is not where we hold the conversation. The problem is whether we get the boots on the ground, which is to say that we're actually seeing traction in terms of social behavioral change. For me, and again, I know that currently for top management, mid-management of middle size to a bit of a higher level enterprises. You're looking at people that are within the ages of 40 and above for most of the companies and big companies. If you track that back to when they would have perhaps attained their first degree, or track that back to when they would have finished high school, you're looking at a time when there was really a very low turnout of women from these institutions of higher learning, a time when there was very little gain in terms of education of the girl child in our societies. So what would be interesting for me is to see how the trends continue within the 5-10-year period from now, to see how we would play out with these issues. Because in the private sector, where I think is a real testing ground, because in the 90s, you would say most of our formal employment was government employment. There's really, we are still having a nascent private sector. But as the times went on, our private sector grew to become the major employer. In the private sector, every employer is trying so hard to get the most out of their employees. And so if we are looking at social behavioral change and economic behavioral change, we will be looking at how it plays out within these next 10 years. And how it plays out, if we wait to see how that happens, it's going to be a problem. I think we are going to have to find a way to find a middle ground. I understand the urge and the movement to have, for example, the heated debate around the 90 days of maternity leave. But if you're looking at private sector employment, 90 days away from a station and being paid the same amount of money that you're getting, if you're talking to an employer, is a very different conversation from when you're talking to a government. Because for an employer, they would have to be compelled to comply. For government, they would probably want to seem like they're moving toward gender equity and so many things that are good about the suggestion. That is where the problem is. Where you have the private sector beginning to definitely dominate job provision in the country, and there's a lot of competition there, then you want to begin to check what issues of management are going to be gender-faced and how are those going to play out in terms of the win on the other side and the win for us. And I think that's where the Attorney General was coming from, that for the argument of how many days of leave, that could also become for employers an argument for why not to employ a couple of people or a particular group of sector of society. And you do not want that to become a conversation in the mainstream where we're saying, okay, before we employ you, we are asking questions of when do you, are you married? Do you intend to have more children? And so on and so forth. Those are indicators that there is a problem in how the country has arrived at the consensus on the law. So for me, it's very important that, yes, we deal with the mindset, but beyond the mindset, we cultivate an economic community that appreciates the necessity to have the best position for their women workers. And that therefore demonstrates a community that's going ahead. How you achieve that is by, first of all, making sure government itself has it. So if government is churning out messaging, if government is churning out positions within the formal government jobs that shows that we respect this requirement of women, we respect this procedure that women have to go through, and we respect this time that we have to give to our mothers, then you are able to send a message to the private sector. So the government sector will, the public sector will lead, but with that leadership, there still needs to be engagement with the private sector.
Thank you, Jacob. I am sorry I have to cut you short.
All right.
Because of two sticky issues that I think if we don't discuss and our time is fast spent, we may lose the context of this conversation. Just to confirm, Patrick, is Elizabeth online?
I think she dropped off again. She's struggling with network a bit.
Okay, I have two important questions that I want us to handle, and I'm going to ask the panelists to just, a bit condense their conversation. Honorable Deke, there's a sticky issue on sexual harassment. You've been an ardent activist in this direction. I know you are one of the framers of the Sexual Offences Act. I know that the new amendment proposes to have each employer have sexual harassment policies as opposed to the initial law, which proposed that only if you have 25. So that threshold has been taken out. But I have two questions on that issue. Number one, is sexual harassment a legal or a cultural issue? Are we dealing with it the wrong way by trying to legalize it? Okay. Elizabeth is on. I'd like Elizabeth to address this issue on sexual harassment just before Honorable Anne comes in. Elizabeth, is the issue on sexual harassment a legal or cultural issue? Are the people at the top really interested in weeding it out? But number two, I think one of the missed opportunities that we have in the amendment is that this amendment does not address the question of sexual harassment.
All right, thank you very much. That is a very interesting question. I think let me begin from the end.
Elizabeth, if I may just
Yes.
chip in a second question that you address as well. The amendment seems to have missed the opportunity to address third-party liability or the liability of the employer for third-party harassment, especially in industries like the service, hospitality, in terms, if I'm harassed by a customer, can the employer take, become liability for, have liability for that? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think, interestingly, one of the things I want to say, the government through the Ministry of Gender on sexual harassment, and maybe why your question on whether it's a legal problem, whether it's a social whether it's a culture.
Is it me or has Elizabeth dropped again?
I think she has dropped off again.
Ah, that is sad. Honorable Deke, can you just come in on the question of the missed opportunity to create third-party liability for third-party harassment?
Okay. Well, I don't know. I haven't personally shared with Honorable Kunihira, but I know that the first amendment, there was an amendment that was brought, I think in July last year. The first amendment came in July last year, and then there was an amendment number 2 that came in December still of last year. So probably in the consultations, it's not something that featured to include, third-party liability, but I'm very certain that it should have been included. I can't really submit firsthand because I wasn't involved in the framing. We just received the committee's work in Parliament, but I dare say that it should have been included because we're trying to broadly capture sexual harassment and everything that it entails. Because for the first time, we see in the second amendment, in the first amendment, an amendment to section 7.4, sexual harassment in employment. Originally, it was about the numbers being 25 and more employees, the requirement to have a policy against sexual harassment. But now, because that one left the employer with a lot of discretionary power, and I think also to cover our obligations under ILO 190, then this amendment was brought. However, that one of third party, I really honestly do not have sufficient information as to why it was left out. But that can happen very often for many legislations, especially if so much research has not been done on it, or if it has been defeated at the point of framing it. For example, the Sexual Offences Bill, when it was first introduced, did have something about marital rape. It did have something about the withdrawal of consent, all which caused the bill almost to fully collapse. So they were taken out to save other parts of the bill. So probably maybe at the formulation stage, that could have been included, and maybe the people that were discussing found it very remote to be included. That's what I think.
Thank you, Honorable Adeke. I can see Elizabeth is not on this call, and that's a bit sad because I think we would have benefited from her perspective. I just want to note also, not from a point of questioning, that the bill does not seem to address sexual harassment at onboarding level. There's a lot of sexual harassment that goes on at the recruitment stage of employees, and perhaps as our voice in Parliament, Honorable Adeke, that is something that you will take back for posterity and for future discussions. But also there's the same level harassment question. I know sometimes the question is harassment about power dynamics or entitlement issues, or is it even gendered? But research coming out now from perhaps more established jurisdictions shows that there is sexual harassment at the same level, but also sexual harassment from same-sex situations. So there is all those proposals that we need to put in perspective. But I will quickly run to the last issue. The last sticky issue is on recruitment of migrant workers. I'll ask Honorable Jacob Beyeru and the rest of the panelists to all chip in. But I would want Jacob's perspective on this on three key issues. Number one of the key issues on this, on the amendments, but even in the old law, is that recruitment of migrant workers, again, we are focusing our bias on the women, because if you've watched the documentary that I think the investigative journalist group that Raymond Kataha and Solomon Seranjaran did on the plight of this one, the most affected people are women in Middle Eastern countries who have a very interesting and painful human rights record. So three issues, Jacob, that Honorable Adeke and Trish can also comment on. There's a jurisdictional question. Does our Employment Act and all its amendments actually help the migrant labor question if we cannot enforce it beyond our borders? Because if the person affecting the woman who is a domestic worker in Oman cannot be brought to book in Uganda, what is the purpose of having that law? Second is the question of repatriation of migrant workers. When the worst has come to the worst, is the government actually committed to bring these people back home? I know we had a situation where the NUP was involved in bringing back people home, and some people politicized it and all, but is that also an abdication of government responsibility? And then the third question is, do we have the audacity and potential to blacklist countries and then determine who we don't engage with in terms of migrant labor? And I know we are really trying to condense this conversation, but it could be bigger and deeper than this. I'll start with Honorable Adeke because I know you have an engagement at midday. So would you just please chip in on those questions, and then Jacob can come in right after you.
All right, thank you very much. On the subject of migrant labor, it was a really difficult debate and difficult position even for the committee to take, because here we are faced with this huge crisis, human rights crisis. We have so many unemployed young women and men who really want to go to the Persian Gulf states to offer their labor, and the means exists of them going, but the human rights concerns in the respective countries were very worrying. So it's a very difficult area to legislate on, because it also involves international law. It involves human rights law. It involves the domestic legislation in the countries where our Ugandans are going to offer their labor. So recruiting persons for employment abroad was really difficult. First of all, it's a very dynamic sector. It's a new sector to the employment environment in Uganda. It's, migrant workers were never regulated before. However, Parliament tried to provide for it, although it doesn't excellently really execute the regulation of that employment relationship, because first of all, there are the international law issues which you've already cited. There are issues about trafficking laws, human rights concerns in the broader perspective, and the employment contract is not in Uganda. The employment contract is in the respective state. So it may not necessarily serve the purpose wholly, but what Parliament was trying to do was to provide a framework to enable more due diligence, so that the girls have, there's a legal requirement to have a next of kin, to be trained. And it was really an inquest to ensure that the employment terms, the employment that would be going for, would be well procured. And that's what the amendment was trying to do. We don't really have a principal law on migrant labor. We've been having regulations. I think 2011, there were regulations, but there's not been a big difference. When you study what other jurisdictions have done, some of them have tried to separate the legislation on migrant labor. And that is, like, for example, in Kenya. However, Kenya is still grappling with the same problem, because it's an international issue, and the employment contract is in the respective state, which also has its own legislation. So the difficulties with Uganda having this, okay, we've provided for it, but it can only do so much in saving our people. There needs to be much more than that. For example, and you see, the thing about us is that we mostly have unemployed or unskilled migrant labor. And some countries are able to secure better bargains for their people because they also export skilled labor. For example, the Philippines export skilled labor. Right now, Kenya, I think because of the so much activism in this area, right now Kenya is, I think, in the final stages of making bilateral agreements with Canada to export skilled labor in form of nurses. So I think that to protect our Ugandans working abroad, it's more than just to provide for them. What this amendment has done is maybe provide for more due diligence before they leave. But once they're out of this country, they're really out of our hands, and all the ghastly things are done to them. So a little more has to be done, and it's more than just legislation. It goes to our bilateral agreements with these countries and the willingness of government to secure the Ugandans working abroad. It's an issue of international law. It involves our foreign missions. It's more than just what the amendment has provided for.
Thank you, Honorable. And Jacob, just before you come in, just something to perhaps also shed light on. In some jurisdictions, when it comes to this law, persons in political offices are not encouraged. In fact, are barred from having, you know, recruitment agencies as companies, them and their relatives. If you did see something that came out in the news recently, a company was advertising for this kind of thing, and it involved a permanent secretary in a government office and their entire family as owning that company, not at liberty to say who they are. But in Philippines, government officials are not involved in recruitment. Do you think part of the problem is that we have big people in government that run recruitment agencies? How do we resolve, especially the jurisdictional questions? If you could submit on this, Jacob, in about 2 or 3 minutes, so that we can have a plenary and have some questions from the audience to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarama. I think this is a very sticky issue. For me, the bottom line is that we have not invested enough in, first of all, the possibility of using this as an economic opportunity for the country, even if it already has, and secondly, in protecting the citizens that go on to the best of our capacity. So yes, there is the Philippines is the best example because about 10% of their population is working out. But when you look at those that are doing what can be classified as migrant work, you are looking at staggering numbers of close to 9-10 million people. Now, if you're talking about Uganda, the last statistics I saw was that we had 400,000 young people in the Gulf countries that are just Gulf countries that are doing migrant work. 400,000, to put that into perspective, is bigger than the numbers employed by the entire government of Uganda in the public sector. Why I find a problem with how much we have invested is that we have not recognized that, one, your entire unemployment situation has been helped so much by this presence of opportunity that gives decent pay in terms of really comparable to what you get for the same kind of jobs, but also even for formal jobs here, what you get is sometimes is dwarfed by what you get from the other side. That's one. Two, the amount of money that is being brought in terms of people sending money back to Uganda, it dwarfs what we get in the same period per month from coffee. So if you're talking about young people who are sacrificing their lives and they are giving you much more than what your coffee gives you in a month, you need to pay more attention to how they live and how you get there. But you see, the way we have handled it in Uganda is that we have reduced it to a commissioner for employment services giving licenses. Very many of the things we are investing in so heavily do not result into more than 10,000, 20,000 jobs. But you're talking about an industry that is growing at a rate of about 10, 20% per annum in terms of actual employment numbers, and you're not going there with a full armor on. So I think that's where, for me, the problem is. About whether government officials can do this or do the other. In Uganda, we are not yet even there. Why? Because the industry itself requires that someone is based in the Middle East before you can send or say you operate a recruiting agency here. Where the biggest problem is for Uganda, and where I think we need to take the next opportunity in this whole situation, is that, one, we are not able to stop anyone from going because they choose of their own volition because of the lack of opportunity here. Nobody is going to sit here, a school dropout, even if not a school dropout, someone that's graduated but has been sitting home for the last 2 years and has the opportunity to earn 1.5, or even if it is to earn 1 million, a month for the next 2 years and they'll sit out on that opportunity. That's going to be very hard. If you're looking at Gulf countries, you're already looking at Sharia law, you're looking at the kafala system. All those need to be invested into by government. And so I don't understand why, and I've made this argument to government, to the minister herself, why we are not pushing for, one, having an embassy in each of the Gulf states, as opposed to the situation we currently have, where one country is serving about 6, one embassy serving about 6, one mission is serving about 6 countries. And yet the 6 countries have over 400,000 Ugandans. Then you find countries where we are less than 10,000 Ugandans having a fully fledged mission. And even those Ugandans who are there don't even want to talk to, or they don't have any business with the embassy in terms of rights and protection and so on. So for me, that's a big issue. The other issue that will be the conclusive one for the remarks is that I think we have failed to see this as an opportunity with its challenges. Why? The way it is advertised, this industry is advertised as, one, a problem for the rights question in Uganda and for migrant workers, which is true. But when you look at the numbers that are going, you cannot ignore the fact that the industry is growing at the fastest rate of industrial growth in terms of employment opportunities in the country ever. So you're not going to tell a population that does not have answers here that, oh, we are caring more about the challenges you might face there, when every single month about 5,000 people are going out on opportunities of that nature. So the question is going to be, what happens to the 5,000? Is it 50% that get challenges? If we're looking at the population of the girls itself, what happens to the over 4,000 or 5,000 who are girls? What happens to them? Can we get stories from all of them? What is the situation? And therefore, how do we work that out? By this time, I told the minister, we should be having Ugandan recruiting agencies that are registered in Dubai, which is a very possible thing. Because what is happening is that companies are the ones recruiting Ugandans and then distributing them to their own jobs. And those companies in the Emiratis, in Qatar, if you're looking at the Jordans, those companies can be owned partly even by government as part of an understanding to protect how they interact with people. Finally, the other solution would be bilateral agreements that have a strong monitoring framework within host countries. That is the reality. You are not going to have a bilateral agreement with Saudi Arabia, which you monitor from Uganda, and in Saudi Arabia, you have 1 or 2 staff that are supposed to basically have, it's largely a reporting desk for people who are under a kafala system where the employers confiscate almost all means of communication. So you're, as a country, not helping your young people who are there, who are now helping your country in such an enormous way with the amount of monies they are remitting to Uganda, and that helps with spurring up the economic growth levels. So I think we are not looking at this as an opportunity to answer employment questions, and yet it is growing on its own. Number 2, I told the minister our level of regulation on this industry is matching our level of interest in protection. It is also matching our levels of seriousness as a country in terms of employment opportunities for young people, which altogether comes to very low interest. So for me, that is where the problem is. And if we get the opportunity, we should make this discussion even bigger and insist on it being a mainstay discussion. You can imagine, okay, I shouldn't say this, but
thank you, Jacob. I have to cut you short, absolutely. But thank you so much for that input. I see Elizabeth is on call. We've missed her perspective on this conversation. Maria, with your permission, I'm going to allow Elizabeth to make some comments on the sexual harassment issues on the amendment, and also this issue of migrant workers, but specifically with a bias to the women migrant workers, of course, who are really most affected because of the gender disparities, especially in Middle East countries where really laws are extremely discriminative against women. Elizabeth, please chip in on those 2 perspectives. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Maria will choose you or unmute you immediately after Elizabeth so that we can have some questions for the panelists. Elizabeth, can you hear me? Right. I don't think Elizabeth can hear me. So I'll just, please raise your hand if you have a question. We'll go just right into it. I hope Honorable Adeke will still be able to answer some questions. Maria, if there are some hands up, please unmute them. I see Brian Paul's hand is up, Maria.
All right, thank you very much for the session. It was really insightful. I don't know if I'm being heard. I would like to confirm that I'm being heard.
We can hear you loud and clear. Please address your question to a specific panelist if you can as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Tarima. So I believe my question is specifically to Honorable Adeke. I hope she's still online. I don't know if I missed this part because a little bit in there, I had some network issues, but I would just like to understand, seeing as one, we appreciate that during the course of our conversation, the ladies are more prone to exploitation in the labor market. A lot of examples have been given, the maids, people doing domestic work here and there. I just want to understand why there's been reluctance in as far as pushing of the minimum wage bill is concerned, or a law on minimum wage in particular, because I believe it would go a long way in solving some of these issues, especially in as far as remuneration is concerned. So I would just like to understand, at least from a legislator's perspective, why there's been some form of reluctance, and it's a discussion that has been going on for several years, but I've not seen anything particularly tangible that has been brought to the table. And then my second concern is maybe for Trish and other of our colleagues in the civil society space. I know we had mentioned something about the fact that we don't have a register, or it's hard to track down people who are, especially people who are in informal employment. I just want to understand if there have been any measures, at least to be kickstarted by civil society, to create a formal semblance of a register so that they can easily follow up with these people who are being exploited and don't necessarily have the financial resources to push back. So I just want to understand whether there is anything being done in that light, just to be able to fill up that gap and make the front the first move before our government can come in and regularize this particular space. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations.
Thank you, Brian. I see another hand. Maria, there's another hand. I think it's to message Brian. This was Brian Paul. Maria, kindly confirm if we have unmuted Brian. Okay, Brian, you have been unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tarima, for the discussion and the members. My concern just then add on the was you. I'm taking an example in this oil and gas sector where we operate to do with these casual workers, and now especially the women. Now something unique happens here within the oil and gas sector where these casual workers, they create what they call a labor database, something like that. From efforts from the village leaders, the chairpersons, collect these people. Now, what is interesting is when you look through these numbers, they actually clear causing. The numbers are so big, almost overwhelming the so-called professionals within the same sector.
Now, my concern with this is to the honorable member, Honorable Adeke. This doesn't such a thing or such things within those individual sectors, because now I'm talking about oil and gas. When you go to the agriculture sector, it is even one. Doesn't such a thing bring a concern? Even the honorable members, I've seen them go to these visits in their constituencies to at least start speaking from that to find a way of either registering them or tracking them, because really the numbers are too big. And when just in the oil and gas sector, you track these people, there are so many, but their rights you don't even know. They don't even know what was supposed fund. They don't hear about things to do with their things to do with NSSF or any other thing. So I think a message to all my political question or a request to the honorable member, one back to that parliament, could we start thinking about this? These people are so many and their rights are just secondary to proceedings in any sector. Otherwise, thank you members for the discussion. It's really been fruitful as far as the plight of workers is concerned.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Honorable Adeke was saying your voice is a bit low, but I just want to give her the summary of what you were discussing. And I'll allow her, because I know she has a commitment. I know she's stretching into our time to have her to cover for her commitment. Honorable Adeke, if you could address MBP's Mugera Brian Paul's question was what efforts are being made to fast track the question of minimum wage. I know the president has been one of the biggest stumbling blocks. And then the second question was on Brian was asking on how the situation on casual laborers can be regularized even further, because the situation, according to him, is getting out of hand, that they now even they outnumber the professionals in some of the sectors. And so it is absolutely relevant that you have discussions on their protections enhanced. I think that was the question. If you could respond to those, you.
All right, thank you very wage bill was introduced. It hit a stalemate. It was not saved under the business in the last parliament, under saved business in the last parliament, so it automatically collapsed. In this last session, which is ending, which has ended, Honorable Lutamaguzi stood up when the Deputy Speaker was chairing Parliament and asked the question as to why the Ministry of Labour has not prioritized the minimum wage bill. Folks, the truth about the minimum wage bill is its enforcement and the difficulty of it, because it's going to send many more of the unskilled Ugandans underground to offer their labor underground, because many investors come to Uganda because they know and believe that labor is cheap. And government has continued to make them believe that labor is cheap, can be got very affordably without all these benefits accruing to the casual laborers. So that is really the same fate to the minimum wage bill. You're seeking to set a minimum wage, which, as Jacob said, should be above the living the cost of living or living wage. It's a little bit difficult for a country that has so much unemployment like our country, and with such a huge number of young people, that a very young population, unskilled, unemployed, and you're setting a minimum wage. in the long term, you drive them underground. But I'm not saying that it's not a good piece of legislation. Yes, it is good, it is needed, and but we need to be aware that we shall be legislating to protect a very small section of people in the labor market. And those are strictly skilled laborers. Otherwise, the ones who are unskilled and casual are going to be driven underground to continue to offer their labor in more difficult circumstances. Because one thing we must know is that every time this legislation such as this is passed, an investor who is seeking to maximize profit is thinking about ways to shortchange. For example, we've talked about a 6-month term, which or contract, which is deemed for the casual laborers. Most employers I know are now going to maybe wait for the fifth month and then maybe terminate these employees. So they are always looking for ways to shortchange the law. And from the minimum wage to really, really protect most of our Ugandans in the labor market, then we have to holistically fix this issue. Make sure that most of our young people are more skilled than unskilled, because they are very vulnerable when they're unskilled. And it's the same thing that goes with casual laborers. It's difficult to regulate these sectors because we have so many vulnerable and desperate Ugandans who are seeking to make a living at any cost. And they will also circumvent the law that protects them just to earn something small. Thank you. I'll be taking my leave. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Honorable Adeke, for your time and for your very valuable insights. We appreciate the work that you do for young Ugandans, especially. I know you're now a woman MP, you're no longer just youth, but thank you so much for the work you do, and we appreciate it and for making time for this conversation. Thank you. Just as Honorable Anna Deke takes her leave, I see a question from Awan Abasa Gimei. Right, yes. Mr. Gimei, if you could make your contribution. We have a few minutes to the end of the webinar, so if you could make your contribution. And Trish, you have a question from Brian Paul on the informal sector register, so please keep that in mind. Honorable Abasa, please.
Yes, am I being heard?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Sir, we can hear you loud and clear. Please
am I being heard?
Please make your contribution.
Someone there?
Honorable Mr. Gimei, we can hear you. Please make your contribution. Maria and Patrick, is it my network or can we
hear
not
me? Oh, sorry,
hear?
I'm not hearing myself. I'm not hearing anyone. Okay. It's unfortunate that the Honorable MP left before I could make my small contribution. But first and foremost, I wish to applaud the organizers of this event. It's my first time to participate in here. I'm a very interested party in matters labor. I would go just specifically to one important issue that was raised by one of the participants here to do with why has Uganda failed to enforce or to enact or even appreciate the value of a labor provider, especially with the issue of the minimum wage. We live in Uganda in a liberalized economy. If you read Article 40, Clause 2, is itself in contradiction with the particular clauses under there. And because of that, in Uganda, which is a third world country, as the Honorable has clearly put it, you come up with a law on a minimum wage, it will be just a very good signing out of all investors, even the smallest we are attracting. Remember, we've just started yesterday creating industrial parks in various regions of Uganda. Some of them have not even taken off. Some of them, even the smallest places that the government has put up, they have not even taken off to this date. So it is something probably that the conversation should start. We should grow it. I remember Honorable Arina Itwe Rakajara, the workers' representative in Parliament. He put up a spirited fight to have it on. And actually there were celebrations in Notu. I remember I was part of that. And all of a sudden it was shut down.
Mr. Gime, I have
the reality.
Mr. Gime, I
before them. So
Mr. Gime, I don't want to cut you short, but I want to ask
for
that
Uganda at this point in time, maybe it's time to come for the minimum wage to take shape in Uganda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gime. I just thought you had a specific question, but thank you for your contribution. Very invaluable. Some comments from the comment section. We have Faith Lumonya talking about the response to the minimum wage being not convincing. So government is letting employers to legally shortchange individuals. Let Parliament just pass the bill and let us see if people will offer their labor underground. Yes, this government is just hypocritical. We need the minimum wage. The people who need it the most are the majority. Those are some of the comments and questions coming in on that issue of minimum wage from one Faith Lumonya. She had also made a contribution on the issue of migrant labor and how the government just doesn't care. Trish, you have a question from MBP. Would you like to answer it at this juncture? We are coming to the closing stages. You have a question on what civil society is doing to come up with that register on informal sector. Would you like to make a response to that? Not sure if Trish is okay. Trish, you're still in the meeting.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I think I'd fallen off, but if I got the question right, is what civil society? I think briefly what my feedback would be, which is not as comprehensive, is that this is the job of the government. So having civil society do government's role is taking away the arm of accountability from government and putting it on civil society, whose funds are policed and whose funds are regulated. And it is only government that can actually come up with a register for domestic and informal workers and not civil society. Because by the time we actually collectively come together to bring in, to register all the domestic workers and all the informal workers in this country, then the damage will have been done. Yet it's easier for government to actually do that because following the different arms of government and the different stages of government in the local government, in the district government, and at the village level. So for me to Brian, I would strongly negate his assertion of having civil society come up with a whole register to register the informal and the domestic workers, because then that does not add up to accountability.
Thank you so much, Trish, for that perspective. Okay, I see some comments from Amanya Katugume. This dialogue is insightful. Thank you so much for your feedback. Maria, what I hear coming out of this conversation is government responsibility and how government needs to take charge of its obligation without having to abdicate it to third parties like civil society and even individuals. I see some edgy or muted responses on questions on minimum wage, and those are issues that keep rising and that affect women in the labor force, but especially women in the informal sector, where they are truly the majority. And if you notice, those are the Ugandans that really keep us running, the women selling tomatoes in the markets, the women who are, who Trish called this very interesting term that I learned in this meeting on domestic enablers and etc. That's what I hear coming out of the conversation. I hear also questions on they had conversations on the recruitment of migrant labor, which again mostly has women in high numbers, and how they are affected. And I see that there is not a straight line on how this can be handled. There's seemingly a tone of resignation on that question, and even contradictions within the corridors of power. I see questions that keep raising up on how politicians are actually owners of these recruitment agencies, and whether that should be something we accept. There are some missed opportunities on questions of sexual harassment that come through this meeting. Of course, very gutted that we could not hear from Elizabeth, but the discussion by and large has tried to cover some of the aspects that we thought are crucial for this discussion. From me to you, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure to keep your company this morning through the afternoon. And to Women Pro Bono Initiative, thank you for this discussion, and I hope we can have more of them. I will now yield the microphone to Maria and Patrick from the Women Pro Bono Initiative to close the meeting and see us off. Thank you so much to the panelists, Jacob, Trisha, Honorable Anna Deke, Elizabeth in part who could not be with us due to circumstances beyond her control, I believe, and Maria. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to the next. Maria, I think I will leave the floor to you now.
I have nothing more useful to add. You have concluded the meeting and started the discussion well. And we thank everyone for participating in this discussion and bringing out their perspectives, but also in whichever way they are able to contribute and steer this discussion and change mindsets, dismantle the patriarchy from wherever angles they are. It's a concerted effort, and we need to change systems as a whole, and we're glad to have all the hands on deck. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.